Humans are the only species that knows it exists, and that knowledge did not make us stronger. It made us anxious. It made us afraid of time. It made us ask questions that no other animal ever needed to survive. Evolution gave us awareness, and in return, it took away peace. So, if this awareness was not necessary to live, then why did humans end up with it? And more importantly, where do humans actually begin? After asking where humans actually begin, the most common answer people reach for is the body. It feels obvious. Humans have bodies, and bodies can be seen, measured, and touched. A body appears at birth, grows, changes, and eventually stops. From the outside, this looks like a clean and reasonable starting point, so it feels natural to say that humans begin with the body. This idea is simple, and simplicity is comforting. But when we slow down and look carefully, the body begins to feel like an incomplete answer rather than a true beginning. The human body is not something that suddenly appeared when humans arrived. Bodies existed long before humans did. Animals had bodies with bones, muscles, organs, and nervous systems. Even creatures far simpler than humans had physical forms that allowed them to move, react, and survive. The human body is not a new invention. It is a variation built from parts that already existed. The heart pumps blood, the lungs move air, muscles contract, and nerves carry signals. None of these systems belong only to humans. They are older than humanity itself. If the human body is made from pieces that existed before humans, then it cannot explain where humans truly begin. At best, it shows where humans appear in visible form. It marks a moment when a specific arrangement of old materials comes together. But that is not the same as an origin. It is more like a continuation of something already in motion. Saying humans begin with the body is like saying a river begins where we first notice it. Even though water has been flowing long before that point, this becomes clearer when we think about how bodies form. A body does not suddenly come into existence at birth. Long before that moment, it is already developing, already responding, already changing. Even that process depends on conditions outside the body itself, such as the environment, the mother, and biological systems shaped over millions of years. Every stage of physical development points backward to something earlier. No matter where we try to place the starting line, it always leads us to a process that began before this particular body existed. Because of this, the body works better as an explanation for how humans function than for where humans begin. It explains movement, survival, and interaction with the physical world. What it does not explain is why humans experience themselves differently from other beings with bodies. Many animals have bodies very similar to ours, yet they do not spend time wondering where they came from. They do not question their own existence. They do not search for origins. The body alone cannot explain this difference. If the body were the true beginning, then having a body would be enough to explain what a human is, but it clearly is not. Bodies sleep, eat, react, and respond to danger. These actions do not require reflection. They do not require awareness of self. They do not require memory reaching far into the past or imagination stretching into futures that may never happen. These things do not arise from flesh alone. So, within this first frame, a clear conclusion starts to form. In this view, humans do not begin with the body. The body is necessary, but it is not the source. It is a carrier shaped by history, biology, and chance. It brings something forward, but it does not create it. When we start with the body, we learn where humans become visible, but we do not learn where they truly begin. That means the beginning we are looking for must lie somewhere beyond the body, waiting to be approached from another direction. When we look closer at the body, another problem appears. Two humans can have bodies that look almost the same, yet live completely different inner lives. They can share the same physical structure, the same senses, even similar abilities, but think differently, feel differently, and see the world in different ways. This shows us that the body alone does not define what a human is. It sets limits and possibilities, but it does not decide meaning, identity, or direction. A body can be healthy or weak. It can be fast or slow. It can survive in harsh conditions or struggle in easy ones. But none of these qualities explain why one person spends their life asking questions, while another never does. None of them explain why humans tell stories about the past, imagine futures that do not exist yet, or worry about things that may never happen. They emerge on top of the body, not from it. If we imagine removing everything except the body, what remains is a biological machine. It reacts to stimuli. It avoids pain. It seeks comfort. This is true for humans and animals alike. The difference appears when humans begin to relate to their own experiences. A body feels pain. A human thinks about pain. A body reacts to danger. A human remembers danger long after it has passed. These differences do not come from the shape of the body. They come from something layered on top of it. This is why the body feels like a surface, not a foundation. It is where human life shows itself, but not where it originates in a meaningful sense. The body carries history inside it, but that history does not belong only to humans. It belongs to life as a whole. Every cell in the human body follows rules that were written long before humans appeared. Every reflex is inherited from creatures that never wondered who they were. The body connects humans to the past, but not specifically to human beginnings. There is also the question of continuity. Bodies change constantly. Cells die and are replaced. Organs adapt. The physical form shifts slowly over time. If the body were the beginning, then the beginning would be constantly changing. Yet humans feel like they remain themselves even as their bodies change. A person does not feel like a different human simply because their body grows older or weaker. This suggests that what we think of as human is not anchored in the body itself. This leads to an important realization. The body answers the question of how humans exist in the world, but not the question of what humans are experiencing while they exist. It explains survival, not awareness. It explains movement, not reflection. And since the question we are asking is where humans actually begin, not merely where they function, the body begins to look like the wrong place to search. So the second layer of this idea becomes clear. Humans do not begin with the body, because the body is shared, inherited, and constantly changing. It is a condition, not an origin. It allows human life to happen, but it does not explain why human life feels the way it does from the inside. If we are trying to understand where humans truly begin, then the body can only take us so far. Beyond that point, it stops answering the question and starts pointing us somewhere else, toward whatever turns a living body into a human experience. If we follow this line of thinking to its end, the role of the body becomes much clearer. The body is where human life takes shape, but it is not where human life begins in any deep sense. It is the stage, not the origin of the play. Everything the body does follows rules that existed long before any human ever questioned their own existence. The body breathes because breathing kept earlier creatures alive. It feels pain because pain protected earlier bodies from harm. It seeks comfort because comfort increased survival. None of these functions were created to produce meaning or self-understanding. And yet, humans experience their bodies differently from other living things. We do not just feel hunger, we think about why we eat. We do not just feel pain, we remember it and fear its return. We do not just rest, we wonder how much time we have left. These layers of experience sit on top of the body rather than inside it. They use the body, but they are not explained by it. This is why pointing to the body as the beginning creates confusion. It answers a physical question, but we are asking an existential one. We are not asking when flesh appears. We are asking when a human appears as a being that knows it is alive. If the body were the true beginning, then every creature with a similar body would share the same inner world. But that is not what we observe. Many animals have bodies just as complex as ours, yet they do not build histories, imagine futures, or search for origins. This tells us that the human difference does not start at the level of flesh. The body provides capacity, but it does not provide direction. It makes experience possible, but it does not explain experience itself. In this sense, the body is like an instrument. It allows something to be played, but it does not write the music. When we say humans begin with the body, we confuse appearance with origin. We mistake the visible entry point for the true starting line. And once we see this clearly, the conclusion of this first truth becomes simple and grounded. In this frame, humans do not begin with the body. It carries the human forward, but it does not create what it carries. It connects humans to the long history of life, but it does not explain why humans stand apart within that history. So, if we are honest about what the body can and cannot tell us, we are forced to move on. The search for where humans actually begin cannot stay at the level of physical form. It has to look beyond the body, toward whatever transforms a living structure into a lived human experience. And that shift is what leads us naturally into the next direction of inquiry. The next place people usually turn after the body is the brain, because the brain feels closer to what makes humans human. Thoughts, memories, emotions, decisions, all of them seem to happen there, so it feels natural to say that humans begin with the brain. Unlike the body, the brain appears to explain more than survival. It explains thinking, it explains learning, it explains behavior that looks uniquely human. But when we examine this idea carefully, the brain begins to show the same problem as the body. The human brain did not suddenly appear with humans. Brains existed long before humans did. Other animals have brains that allow them to learn, remember, solve problems, and even communicate in complex ways. The human brain is larger and more developed in certain areas, but it is still built from the same basic structure that existed in earlier forms of life. Neurons fire, signals travel, patterns repeat. These mechanisms are not unique to humans. They are inherited systems refined over time. If the brain were the true beginning, then increasing complexity alone would explain humanity. But complexity by itself does not explain why humans experience the world the way they do. A more complex brain can process more information, but processing information is not the same as asking questions about existence. Many animals make decisions and learn from experience. Yet they do not wonder where they came from or what their lives mean. This suggests that the difference is not simply how much the brain can do, but how humans relate to what the brain produces. The brain generates thoughts, but humans observe those thoughts. The brain produces emotions, but humans reflect on those emotions. This separation is subtle but important. If the brain were the beginning, then thoughts would simply happen and pass without being noticed. But humans notice their own thinking. They step back from it. They judge it. They worry about it. That extra layer is not easily explained by neurons alone. There is also the problem of continuity. Brains change over time. Neural connections strengthen and weaken. Memories fade or reshape themselves. Injuries can alter personality. And yet, even as the brain changes, humans often feel like the same person. This suggests that whatever we mean by a human beginning is not anchored to a fixed brain state. If it were, identity would disappear every time the brain changed. The brain explains how experiences are carried, but not why humans experience themselves as a continuous self moving through time. So within this second frame, another clear answer begins to form. In this view, humans do not begin with the brain either. The brain is essential, just like the body. But it is still a mechanism, not an origin. It produces the conditions for awareness, but it does not explain why awareness turns inward and asks questions about itself. The brain can generate thoughts, but it does not explain why humans treat those thoughts as something that needs meaning. So just like the body, the brain takes us closer to understanding how humans function, but it still stops short of explaining where humans actually begin, which means the search must move again, away from structure and toward whatever causes humans to step back from their own minds and recognize themselves as something more than just thinking matter. If humans do not begin with the body and do not begin with to the brain, then the next place to look is not another organ, but a change in how life is lived. At some point, humans began to do something unusual. They began to notice themselves. noticing the world, they did not just see objects. They noticed that they were the ones seeing them. They did not just feel fear. They became aware that fear belonged to them. This may sound simple, but it marks a profound shift, because the moment a being can step back and observe its own experience, it is no longer fully inside the flow of life. It becomes slightly separate from it. Animals react to the world directly. Hunger leads to eating. Danger leads to escape. Rest leads to sleep. But humans add another layer on top of reaction. They think about their reactions. They remember them. They compare them. They imagine how they might feel again later. This habit changes everything because it creates an inner space where experience is held and examined, and once that space exists, time changes, meaning changes, and identity begins to form in a way that did not exist before. This does not mean animals have no awareness, but human awareness behaves differently. It turns inward and loops back on itself, asking questions that serve no immediate survival purpose, wondering about past choices, worrying about future outcomes, imagining lives that could have been lived but were not. This looping does not help the body run faster, or the brain solve simple problems. Instead, it creates a sense of self stretched across time, a self that remembers who it was and worries about who it will become. And this may be one of the first places where something recognizably human begins, not as a moment in history, but as a pattern of attention, a way of relating to experience rather than a new physical structure. Because once attention turns inward, humans stop being only participants in life and become observers of their own participation. They begin to form stories about themselves, linking memories together into a narrative that feels continuous, even though the body and brain are constantly changing. This narrative does not exist in the body or the brain alone. It exists in the relationship between experience and reflection. And this is why humans care so deeply about origins, stories, identity, and meaning. These concerns arise naturally once a being sees itself as something that persists over time. If you believe you are the same person today as you were years ago, then it becomes important to ask where that person started and where it is going. And in this sense, humans may begin not when a new organ appears, but when this reflective loop becomes strong enough to dominate experience. When life is no longer just lived, but also watched and evaluated. From the inside, this does not happen suddenly, and it does not happen everywhere at once. It emerges slowly, unevenly, and without a clear boundary. Some early humans may have lived mostly like animals, while others began to carry this inner observer more strongly. But once this pattern took hold, it changed the direction of human life. Because reflection leads to planning, planning leads to culture, culture leads to shared stories, and shared stories reinforce the sense of a self that exists beyond the present moment. And so within this frame, a tentative answer comes into view. Humans may begin at the point where awareness turns back on itself, creating an inner witness that follows experience through time, not as a sharp beginning, but as a gradual shift in how life is experienced. And this answer does not contradict what came before it, builds on it, because the body provides the vessel, the brain provides the mechanism, but the human difference appears when attention folds inward and begins to ask what all of this means, and that inward turn quietly sets the stage for everything that follows, as it carries humans away from simple reaction and into a world shaped by memory, imagination, and the constant search for a beginning that feels solid enough to explain who they think they are. And as awareness begins to turn inward, the next shift happens quietly through memory and language, because noticing an experience is one thing, but keeping it is something else. Most animals experience the world and then move on. What happens fades as soon as it passes. But humans hold on to moments. They replay them, they name them, they store them, and later they tell them again. This changes the shape of life completely, because once an experience can be remembered, it no longer belongs only to the present. It can be carried forward, altered, and compared with other experiences. Memory stretches a single moment across time, and language gives that stretched moment a form that can be shared. This is where human life begins to step away from pure immediacy, because a remembered experience is not the same as a lived one. It is filtered, reshaped, simplified, or exaggerated. And yet it feels real enough to guide future choices. When a human remembers fear, the body may react, even though no danger is present. When a human remembers joy, the feeling can return without the original cause. And this means humans do not live only in what is happening. They live in what has happened and in what might happen next. Language strengthens this effect by turning private memory into shared meaning once an experience is named. It becomes easier to carry and easier to pass on. Words allow humans to compress complex feelings into simple signals, and once those signals exist, they can outlive the original experience. A story can be told to someone who was never there and still shape how they see the world. This is something no body or brain alone can explain, because language is not just sound, it is agreement. It is a shared system that allows one mind to enter another without direct experience. And when humans begin to rely on memory and language, their sense of self expands across time. They are no longer just the person who is here now. They are also the person they remember being and the person they imagine becoming. Because the body changes and the brain rewires, but the story remains. And that story becomes the anchor of identity. When humans ask where they begin, this is often what they are really pointing toward. Not the first body or the first brain, but the moment life becomes something that can be remembered, named and explained even to oneself. Because once experience can be told, it can be questioned. And once it can be questioned, it can be given meaning. This does not mean language or memory appeared all at once. It happened gradually, unevenly, and without a clear boundary. Early humans likely lived long periods without this constant inner narration. But as memory grew stronger and language more structured, the present moment stopped being enough. Humans began to carry the past with them and project themselves into the future. And this created a new kind of existence, one that is not defined by what is happening now, but by what has happened before and what could to happen later. And within this frame, a clear answer begins to take shape. In this view, humans begin when experience stops disappearing and starts accumulating, when life becomes something that can be stored, recalled, and reshaped through words. This does not cancel what came before it, builds on it. The body allows experience, the brain processes it, but memory and language allow it to persist, and once persistence exists, so does identity stretched across time. And once identity exists, questions about origin become unavoidable, because a being that remembers must ask where it came from. And that is why the search for a beginning becomes so important only after life can be remembered and told, because before that, there is no story to begin and no need to. Locate a starting point, and this shift quietly explains why humans care so deeply about beginnings, while the rest of life simply continues without ever asking where it started. Humans do not experience time the same way other animals do, and this difference quietly changes everything. Most animals live almost entirely in what is happening right now. Hunger appears, they eat. Danger appears, they run. When the moment passes, it is gone. There is no strong pull backward and no long reach forward. For humans, this is not how life feels. Even when nothing is happening, the mind is rarely still. Thoughts drift to earlier moments, to mistakes, to memories, to things that should have gone differently. Then they move forward again, imagining what might happen next, what could be lost, what could be gained. The present moment becomes only a small part of experience, often overshadowed by what is no longer here or what has not arrived yet. This shift may seem normal to us, but it is deeply unusual in the living world. When humans began to live like this, time stopped being just a sequence of moments and became something psychological. The past was no longer gone, and the future was no longer distant. Both could be carried inside the mind at the same time. This creates a strange tension, because the body still exists in the present, while the mind moves elsewhere. A human can sit safely in a quiet room and still feel fear because of something remembered, or anxiety because of something imagined. The body has not moved, but the experience has. This suggests that part of what makes humans human is not just awareness, memory, or language, but the way these things reshape time itself. Life stops being lived only as it happens and starts being lived as it is remembered and anticipated. When this happens, the idea of a beginning becomes more important. A being that lives only in the present does not need an origin story. It does not look backward and ask where it came from. But a being that carries the past and imagines the future naturally begins to wonder when its own story started. This is why humans care so much about beginnings, first moments, and origins. These questions arise not from biology alone, but from a mind that no longer stays anchored to now. Once time stretches in this way, identity stretches with it. A human becomes someone who was something before and will be something later. The present self feels connected to earlier versions and responsible for future ones. This connection does not exist in the same way for other animals. And because of this, humans begin to experience time not just as movement, but as pressure. The past can feel heavy. The future can feel threatening or hopeful. The present becomes something to escape from or rush through. In this frame, a clear answer starts to form. From this angle, humans begin to differ from other life when they stop living entirely in the present moment. When time becomes something they mentally inhabit rather than simply pass through, life takes on a different shape. The question of where humans begin becomes tied to when this shift happens. When moments stop disappearing and start accumulating, pulling the mind backward and forward at the same time and slowly turning existence into a story that feels like it must have a starting point somewhere behind it. Through time, in a way that has nothing to do with clocks or calendars, because the mind learns how to travel without the body. Memory pulls attention backward, replaying moments that no longer exist, while imagination pulls attention forward, creating scenes that have never happened, and the present moment becomes something thin and fragile, caught between what is remembered and what is expected. A person can be physically here, yet mentally years away. Reliving a single sentence, a single mistake, or a single loss over and over again as if it were still happening require motion. It happens while the body remains still and safe, and this is what makes it so powerful, because danger no longer needs to be present to be felt, and joy no longer needs to be happening to be missed. Humans carry entire timelines inside themselves, and those timelines constantly overlap. I thought about tomorrow can interrupt today. A memory from childhood can reshape how a moment feels right now. And this creates a kind of inner travel that no other living creature seems to experience. In the same way animals may remember in simple forms, but they do not appear to leave the present moment and wander for long periods through what was or what might be. For humans, this wandering becomes constant, almost automatic. The mind drifts backward and forward even when there is no clear reason. And this changes how life is experienced, because actions are no longer guided only by what is happening now, but by what has happened before and what might happen next. Fear becomes stronger because it can be remembered and anticipated. Desire becomes more complex because it can be imagined long before it is satisfied, and loss becomes heavier because it does not fade when the moment ends. This ability to move through time mentally creates continuity, a sense that life is not a series of separate moments but one long line with a past that explains the present and a future that gives it direction. And once this line exists, the question of beginnings becomes unavoidable. Feels incomplete without an origin. so intensely for first moments, first humans, first stories, first causes. These searches are not driven by biology alone. They are driven by a mind that has learned to move beyond now. And once this movement becomes normal, it reshapes identity. A human is no longer just what is happening at this moment, but also what has already happened and what is expected to happen later. Responsibility, guilt, hope, and ambition all depend on this stretching of time because they require a connection between past actions and future outcomes. And this connection exists only for a mind that can travel internally through time and carry those journeys back into the present. So within this frame, another clear answer emerges from this angle. Life is no longer lived only moment by moment, but also remembered and projected. And once this shift takes hold, the present can never fully contain human experience again, because every moment is crowded with echoes from behind and shadows from ahead. And that crowdedness becomes a defining feature of what it means to be human. To live across time rather than inside a single moment. That movement brings a cost, because carrying the past and the future at the same time creates weight. The past no longer disappears. It returns as regret, guilt, or nostalgia, while the future arrives early, as worry, fear, or hope. These feelings do not help the body survive in the present moment. They do not make a human faster or stronger, but they shape behavior anyway, and this is where time turns into a burden rather than a simple flow, because a human can suffer from things that are no longer happening, and from things that may never happen at all. This suffering does not require danger. It only requires memory and imagination. Working together, and once that happens, rest becomes difficult. Even in safety, the mind continues to move backward and forward, replaying scenes, rewriting conversations, preparing for futures that cannot yet be known. This constant movement creates pressure, a sense that the present is never enough because it is always being compared to what came before or measured against what might come next, and this pressure is deeply human. Other animals feel stress, but it passes. When the moment passes, humans hold on to stress long after the cause is gone because it has been stored inside time. When this happens, life begins to feel like a timeline that must be managed. Mistakes become heavy because they are remembered. Choices become frightening because they shape imagined futures, and existence turns into something that must be justified rather than simply lived. This is why humans ask where they come from and where they are going, because a being stretched across time needs anchors. It needs beginnings to explain how it arrived here and endings to make sense of where it is heading. And within this frame, the answer of this truth becomes clear from this angle. The future can threaten or promise when life is no longer just happening but is being evaluated across an invisible timeline. And this does not mean that time itself changed. It means that the human relationship to time changed, and that change transformed experience into something heavier, more complex, and more meaningful at the same time. And once this burden appears, it never fully leaves, because as long as humans remember and imagine, they will continue to live outside the present moment, pulled backward and forward by time that exists only in the mind. And this explains why. The question of beginnings becomes so important only for humans, because only a being that carries time as a mental load needs to know where the story started in order to understand why it feels so heavy now. And once humans begin to carry time as a mental weight, another realization quietly follows the awareness that this timeline does not stretch forever. At some point, humans notice something that most other living creatures do not. They notice that their life will end. Habit is a deeper understanding that even in safety, even in comfort, the body will eventually stop. This knowledge does not arrive as a single moment. It grows slowly through observation, through seeing others age, weaken, and disappear, and through realizing that the same process applies inward as well. This awareness changes how everything feels, because once a human knows that life has an ending, every moment gains a different meaning. Actions are no longer just reactions, They become choices that take place under a deadline, even when that deadline is not visible. And this is where fear takes a new form, not fear of immediate harm, but fear of eventual disappearance. A fear that cannot be escaped by running or hiding because it is not attached to a specific threat. It is attached to time itself. Depends on the future that has already been imagined. This kind of fear reshapes behavior. People plan, they prepare, they seek security, they look for ways to last longer, to be remembered, or to matter beyond their own lifetime. None of this is required for survival in the moment, but all of it makes sense once a being understands that it will not always be here. This is why humans care so deeply about legacy, about children, about stories, about names carved into stone. These are not just cultural habits, they are responses to the deeply for awareness of an ending, and when this awareness takes hold, the question of beginnings becomes even more urgent, because if life ends, then knowing where it started feels like a way to frame its meaning. A story with an ending feels incomplete, without a beginning to balance it, and so humans look backward not only out of curiosity but out of need, trying to understand what kind of thing they are, if it is the kind of thing that must eventually disappear. This does not mean that early humans suddenly feared death in the way modern humans do. But as awareness deepened and memory and imagination strengthened, the idea of an ending became harder to ignore. The mind could now picture a future without itself, and that picture carries weight once it exists. It does not go away. It lingers beneath daily life, shaping priorities, anxieties, and values. And this marks another shift in what it means to be human. From this angle, living as if life simply continues, and start living with the quiet knowledge that it does not, and that knowledge becomes a constant background presence, influencing how time is felt, how choices are made, and why questions about origin and purpose begin to matter so deeply. And once humans become aware that life will end, the next impulse often appears quietly, the desire not to disappear completely. This desire does not always show itself as fear. Sometimes it shows itself as effort, as creation, as attachment. Humans begin to look for ways to extend themselves beyond the limits of their own bodies, and this is where the need to leave something behind takes shape. Having children becomes more than reproduction. It becomes continuation, a way for something of oneself to move forward into a future that the body will never reach. Telling stories becomes more than communication. It becomes preservation, a way to keep experiences alive after the moment has passed and after the person who lived them is gone. Even simple acts like naming places, building, objects, or recording events can be traced back to this same impulse, the wish to remain present in a world that will continue without us. This impulse does not require conscious planning. It grows naturally once the idea of an ending exists, because if life is temporary, then meaning feels fragile, and fragile things invite protection. Humans protect meaning by spreading it across time, by embedding it in other people, in objects, in memories that can survive individual lives. This is why humans care so much about recognition and remembrance, being seen, being known, being remembered. These desires are not just about ego. They are responses to impermanence. A being that knows it will vanish looks for ways not to vanish completely, and this search reshapes behavior, priorities, and values. Actions are chosen not only for immediate benefit, but for how they might echo later. A person may endure hardship now to secure a future for their children. A culture may to preserve traditions, to maintain continuity across generations. These choices do not make sense if life is only about the present moment. They make sense only if life is understood as a limited span inside a longer timeline. And this is where the connection between endings and beginnings becomes stronger, because once humans try to extend themselves beyond their own lifespan, they begin to think in terms of chains, ancestors, descendants, origins, legacies. life becomes something that stretches backward and forward, and the individual becomes one link inside that chain. This framing reduces the pras, fear of disappearance, by placing the self inside something larger and longer lasting, and in doing so, it reinforces the importance of knowing where the chain began. A being that seeks continuity must believe that continuity has a source, and so the desire to leave a trace naturally turns into a desire to understand origins, not only personal origins, but human origins, because knowing where the chain started gives weight to where it might be going, and this shows that the search for beginnings is not just intellectual curiosity, it is emotional strategy. It is a way of coping with finitude, by anchoring oneself to a story that existed before and will continue after, and within this frame, another clear answer emerges. Begin to care deeply about not disappearing, and that concern shapes everything from family structures to cultural memory to the questions humans ask about themselves and their place in the world. And as humans try to leave something behind, the need to understand beginnings becomes even stronger, because an ending without a beginning feels empty. A life that disappears without context feels unfinished, so humans look backward, searching for origins as a way to balance the knowledge of an ending. If life must stop, then it feels important to know where it came from, not only on a personal level, but on a collective one. Knowing where humans began gives structure to the idea that humans will end. It places individual lives inside a larger arc that feels meaningful rather than random. This is why stories of origin appear in every culture, not because they are all accurate, but because they all serve the same psychological need they give shape to: existence, by framing it between a start and a finish. And when humans accept that they will die, the question of beginnings becomes a way to stabilize identity. A person who knows where they come from feels less like a brief accident and more like part of a longer process, stretching across generations. This does not remove the fear of death, but it softens it by placing the self inside something that existed before and will continue after. And this explains why humans often link origins to meaning a life that begins somewhere specific feels easier to justify than one that simply appears inside an endless flow. And so the search for human beginnings becomes a response to mortality rather than a purely scientific problem. Deeper concern: what kind of thing am I if I must disappear? And what kind of story am I part of? If my life has an ending, this does not mean humans invented beginnings to avoid truth, without some sense of where it started. And within this frame, the answer of this truck becomes clear. From this angle, humans begin to care about origins. When they become aware of endings, the need to locate a starting point arises not at the dawn of biology, but at the moment when mortality becomes conscious. And once that awareness exists, the search for beginnings never truly stops, because it serves as a counterweight to the knowledge that life is finite and fragile. Questions that no other species seems compelled to ask. And as humans live with awareness of time and death, another shift quietly reshapes identity. The moment the self is no longer experienced as something isolated, but as something seen through others. Humans do not discover who they are. Alone, they discover it by comparison, by reflection, and by position within. A group from very early on, a person learns who they are, not only through their own body or thoughts, but through how they are treated, named, valued, or ignored by those around them. Relationship rather than existence alone, animals live among others, but they do not appear to measure themselves against them in the same way humans do. Humans look sideways, constantly noticing differences in strength, ability, status, success, and belonging, and these comparisons slowly form an inner map of identity. A human becomes someone not just because they exist, but because they occupy a place among others. This place can feel stable or uncertain, high or low, accepted or excluded, and each of these positions shapes how a person experiences life. When identity depends on comparison, the question of beginning changes again. because the self is no longer something that starts inside the body or mind. It starts to emerge between people. A child learns who they are by seeing how they are responded to, praised, corrected, or overlooked, and this feedback becomes part of their sense of self long before they can name it. In this way, the self is not born fully formed, it is shaped through interaction. And once this happens, humans begin to measure their lives against social standards rather than biological ones. Worth is no longer only about survival. It becomes about recognition, approval, and belonging. And this creates a new pressure. Because social identity is unstable, it can change quickly depending on context, group, or status. A person may feel important in one setting and invisible in another. And this instability deepens the need to understand where one belongs and where one comes from, because belonging feels stronger when it is rooted in something larger than the present moment. Family, lineage, culture, shared history. These provide a sense of placement that individual interaction cannot always guarantee. And so within this frame, a new answer starts to form. From this angle, humans begin to experience themselves when identity becomes relational, when the self is defined not only by being alive, but by being seen, compared, and positioned among others. And this marks a shift from existing as an individual organism to existing as a social being whose sense of self depends on connection, separation, and constant comparison inside a group. Once identity becomes shaped by others, comparison slowly turns into the main way humans understand their own value. A person no longer asks only what they can do, but where they stand. Attention becomes a signal. Praise becomes proof. Humans begin to notice who is admired, who is ignored, who is followed, and who is left behind. And these observations quietly reshape how they feel about themselves. Worth stops feeling like something natural and starts feeling like something measured. A human can feel confident not because they are capable, but because they are recognized, and feel inadequate not because they have failed, but because they have been placed lower in the social order. This creates a fragile sense of self, because social positions are never stable. What gives value in one group may mean nothing in another. A person can move through the same day feeling important in one moment and insignificant in the next, without changing anything about who they are. This instability keeps the mind alert, constantly scanning for signs of approval or rejection, trying to locate itself again and again. Over time, this constant measuring becomes exhausting. Success is no longer just success. It is comparison. Failure is no longer just failure. It is loss of position. Even neutral moments are filtered through how they affect status. A small compliment can lift identity, and a minor exclusion can shake it deeply. This sensitivity does not come from survival needs. Animals compete, but they do not seem to turn rank into personal meaning. Humans do. Social position becomes part of the story they tell themselves about who they are, and once identity is built this way, the question of beginnings shifts again. If value depends on position, then origin starts to matter socially. Where someone comes from, who their parents were, what group they belong to, what history they carry, all of this begins to act as borrowed value. It provides a sense of belonging that does not need to be renegotiated in every interaction. This is why lineage, culture, and background carry such emotional weight. They promise stability in a world where comparison never stops. They say you belong before you prove anything. But this stability comes at a cost. Once value is tied to origin, groups harden. Us and them appear. Higher and lower take shape. Identity becomes collective as well as personal, and a person begins to carry the weight of their group's position. How they see themselves and how they are seen is filtered through that shared label. Within this frame, another answer becomes clear. From this angle, humans begin to experience identity as something that must be measured, ranked, and defended. The idea of where someone comes from moves out of the body and the mind and into social space. And comparison quietly defines how much a person feels they matter. The sense of self slowly drifts away from anything internal and starts to depend on structures that existed before the individual ever appeared. A person no longer feels defined only by their actions or thoughts, but by where they are placed within a larger social map. This is where origin takes on a new meaning. It is no longer just about biology or personal history, but about social roots, family background, cultural identity, nationality, class, and shared narratives begin to act as anchors for the self. They offer a ready-made explanation for who someone is supposed to be. In a world where value is constantly measured and remeasured, these origins provide stability. They suggest that worth existed before comparison began. A person can feel grounded by saying where they come from, even if they are unsure of who they are becoming. But this grounding also limits movement. When identity is tied too tightly to social origin, it becomes harder to step outside assigned roles. Expectations follow origin. Judgments arrive early. A person may feel defined before they act, categorized before they speak. This creates tension, because humans want both belonging and freedom. They want to be part of something larger, yet also want to define themselves independently. Social origin promises belonging, but it often does so by narrowing possibility. Humans begin to ask not only where they come from as individuals, but what group they belong to, and what that belonging demands of them. This is why origin stories become powerful at the social level. They explain why certain groups exist, why they hold status, and why they deserve recognition. These stories reduce uncertainty by fixing identity in the past, but they also lock identity into comparisons that are hard to escape. Within this frame, a clear answer emerges. From this angle, humans begin to experience themselves as social beings, when origin becomes a source of value and limitation at the same time. The self is no longer simply lived. It is inherited, compared, and defended within a social structure. And once this happens, the question of where humans begin moves outward again, away from the individual and into the shared systems that define belonging, hierarchy, and meaning long before any single person becomes aware of themselves. At some point, living and comparing are no longer enough for humans, because the mind begins to feel uncomfortable with events that have no explanation. Things happen without warning. Loss appears without reason. Effort does not always lead to reward. From a purely biological perspective, this is not a problem. Life continues regardless. But for humans, unexplained experience creates tension. The mind wants causes. It wants links. It wants to know why something happened and what it means. Without that, experience feels unfinished, as if something important is missing. This discomfort is subtle at first, but it grows stronger as awareness deepens. A human does not just experience pain or success. They immediately begin to ask what it says about them, about the world, or about the future. Randomness feels threatening, not because it harms the body, but because it undermines understanding. When events seem disconnected, humans feel lost inside them. This is where the need for meaning quietly appears. Meaning acts as a bridge between experience and understanding. It turns isolated moments into a pattern. It allows a person to say this happened for a reason, even if that reason cannot be proven. This does not make life safer in a physical sense, but it makes it bearable in a mental one. Humans begin to create explanations not because they are always accurate, but because explanations reduce uncertainty. They make experience feel navigable. Without them, the mind keeps circling the same questions, unable to settle. This need becomes especially strong when humans face suffering that cannot be controlled. When effort fails, when loss feels undeserved, when outcomes do not match intention, the absence of explanation becomes painful. In these moments, meaning is not a luxury. It becomes a psychological necessity. A story that explains suffering can be easier to live with than silence. This is why humans are drawn to narratives that connect events into a larger order. These narratives do not need to be complex. They only need to offer a sense that things fit together somehow. Once this habit forms, humans no longer experience life as a sequence of separate events. They experience it as something that should make sense, And when sense is missing, the mind feels compelled to search for it. From this angle, humans begin to change when they stop accepting experience as it comes and start demanding explanations for it. The need to understand why becomes as important as the experience itself. And this demand quietly pushes the mind backward, searching for causes, patterns, and eventually origins that can make the present feel coherent rather than random. Once the need for explanation appears, humans do not wait for answers to arrive on their own. They begin to create them. When reality feels uncertain or unfair, the mind looks for patterns that can connect events into something understandable. These patterns do not need to be proven to be useful. They only need to feel coherent. This is how meaning is formed. Humans turn experience into stories, and stories into systems. A painful event becomes a lesson. A random success becomes a sign. Repetition becomes destiny. This process happens quietly and constantly. People explain their own lives this way, and societies do the same on a larger scale. Shared explanations become beliefs, traditions, and worldviews. They offer stability in a world that otherwise feels unpredictable. Without these structures, experience would feel fragmented, as if nothing belonged together. Meaning smooths the edges. It tells the mind that events are connected, that there is a reason behind what happens, even if that reason cannot be fully known. This does not remove suffering, but it gives suffering a place. A hardship that fits into a story feels easier to carry than one that stands alone. This is why humans often prefer an uncomfortable explanation to no explanation at all. Silence leaves experience open, and open experience creates anxiety. A story closes the gap. It allows the mind to rest. Over time, these explanations become habits of thought. Humans stop asking whether a story is true and start asking whether it makes sense. Sense becomes more important than accuracy. A narrative that explains loss, effort, or failure becomes part of identity. A person may say this happened to make me stronger, or this was meant to teach me something. These statements do not describe reality in a scientific way, but they organize experience in a way the mind can live with. On a collective level, the same process happens. Societies explain their struggles through shared meanings. Decline becomes punishment or test. These explanations reduce uncertainty by placing events inside a larger order. Once this habit is established, humans begin to rely on meaning not just to explain the past, but to guide the future. Choices are made based on what fits the story. Actions feel right or wrong depending on how they align with the meaning a person or group has accepted. This creates direction. Life feels less random, but it also narrows perception. When meaning is fixed too tightly, new experiences are forced to fit old explanations. Contradictions are ignored. Complexity is simplified. Still, the need for meaning persists, because without it, the mind returns to uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. This is why humans keep building layers of explanation, even when earlier ones stop working. It only changes form. Within this frame, another answer becomes clear. From this angle, humans begin to differ from other life when they stop enduring experience silently and start organizing it into explanations. The creation of meaning is not a luxury added after survival. It becomes a core function of the human mind. It allows humans to live with loss, effort, and unpredictability by placing them inside a narrative that feels intentional rather than chaotic. And once meaning becomes central to experience, the question of where meaning itself comes from inevitably follows, pushing the human mind further backward in search of deeper explanations that can support all the others at once. A final tension quietly appears because meanings themselves begin to feel unstable. One explanation works for a while, then life changes and it no longer fits. A belief that once brought comfort starts to feel thin. A story that once made sense begins to crack under new experience. When this happens, the mind does not abandon meaning altogether. It looks for a deeper one. Humans begin to search beneath surface explanations, asking where all meanings come from in the first place. This is the moment when questions stop being about single events and turn toward origins. Instead of asking why did this happen, humans begin to ask why anything happens at all. This shift happens because the mind wants a foundation that cannot easily collapse. If every meaning depends on another meaning, then nothing feels solid. Origins promise solidity. They suggest a starting point that explains everything that follows. If humans can locate where they began, then perhaps all the meanings built on top of that beginning will feel more secure. This is why origin stories carry such power. They do not just explain the past, they support the entire structure of meaning above them. A story about where humans come from becomes a story about why human life matters. It tells people not only how things started, but how they should be understood now. This is also why humans return to origin questions again and again across cultures and time. Different explanations replace one another, but the need behind them remains the same. The mind wants a deepest reason, something that does not need further explanation. Whether that reason is described as nature, design, chance, or purpose matters less than the role it plays. It anchors meaning. It stops the endless questioning, at least temporarily. From this angle, the question of where humans actually begin is not simply about biology or history. It is about stability. Humans search for beginnings because beginnings promise a place to stand. They promise that experience is not floating without support. Once a beginning is accepted, even temporarily, it allows all other meanings to line up behind it. Life feels less chaotic. Suffering feels more understandable. Choices feel more grounded. This does not mean the beginning is objectively true in every detail. It means it is psychologically necessary. A mind that demands explanation cannot live forever without a final reference point. And so the search for origins becomes the ultimate meaning-making act. It is where all smaller explanations point when they can no longer hold on their own. From this angle, humans begin when they are no longer satisfied with meanings that explain only parts of life, and start searching for a beginning that can explain the whole. The idea of origin becomes the deepest story humans tell themselves, not because it solves every problem, but because it allows all other meanings to exist without collapsing into uncertainty. And as long as humans continue to seek meaning, they will continue to return to the question of where everything started, believing that somewhere behind them there must be a point where understanding can finally rest. At a certain point, explanation alone is no longer enough for the human mind. Because explanations can always be questioned and revised, meaning can shift, stories can break. When this happens too often, experience begins to feel unstable again. This is where the need for something deeper quietly appears. The need to believe that beneath all uncertainty there is some kind of order holding everything together. Humans begin to feel uncomfortable with the idea that the world is entirely chaotic, that events happen without structure, direction, or consistency. Even if life feels unpredictable on the surface, the mind wants to assume that something underneath remains steady. This assumption does not come from evidence alone. It comes from psychological necessity. A world with no underlying order is difficult to live in because it offers no ground on which expectations can stand. When humans begin to believe that reality follows patterns, rules, or principles, experience becomes easier to navigate. Actions feel less random. Outcomes feel less arbitrary. This belief does not need to be precise. It only needs to exist. Some people describe this order as nature, others as fate, design, balance, or law. The names differ, but the function is the same. They provide a sense that the world is not simply falling forward moment by moment without direction. Once this belief takes hold, humans start interpreting events through it. A coincidence becomes meaningful. A repeated outcome becomes a rule. A sequence becomes a pattern. This does not mean the pattern is always real in an objective sense, but it feels real enough to guide behavior. People plan their lives around what they believe the world allows or forbids. They make choices based on what they think will work within this assumed structure. In this way, belief in order becomes practical. It shapes decisions long before it is questioned intellectually. This marks another shift in what it means to be human. Life is no longer just something that happens or something that is explained after the fact. It becomes something that is expected to follow a certain shape. When expectations are met, the belief in order strengthens. When they are broken, the mind searches for a higher or hidden order to explain the disruption. Very rarely does it accept that there may be none. This shows that the belief itself is more important than its accuracy. Humans need to feel that reality is organized, because organization reduces anxiety. It allows the future to be imagined without constant fear. It allows effort to feel worthwhile. It allows suffering to feel temporary rather than meaningless. Why act, plan, or endure if nothing connects action to outcome? So belief becomes a quiet foundation beneath daily life. People may disagree about what kind of order exists, but very few are comfortable believing that none exists at all. This belief also changes how humans think about beginnings. If the world has order now, then it must have come from somewhere. Order implies structure, and structure implies an origin. Humans begin to assume that things did not always look the way they do, but that they were arranged into this form. The idea of a beginning becomes tied to the idea of order. To know where humans begin starts to feel similar to knowing where the order of the world begins. This does not require religion or philosophy. It appears naturally whenever the mind tries to stabilize reality. In this frame, humans begin to live not just inside experience, meaning, or society, but inside an assumed structure that holds everything together. And once that assumption is in place, the question of origin shifts again. It is no longer just about humans as individuals or groups. It becomes about the beginning of the order they believe they are part of. Because understanding that beginning promises to explain not only where humans came from, but why the world feels structured enough to live in at all. Belief in order does not stay abstract for long, because humans quickly learn how to protect and reinforce it in daily life. Once a person assumes that the world follows some kind of structure, they begin to look for confirmation everywhere. Patterns are remembered, while contradictions are softened or explained away. When something works, it is taken as proof that the order is real. When something fails, it is treated as an exception, a misunderstanding, or part of a larger plan not yet visible. This selective attention is not a flaw, it is a function. It allows belief to survive contact with a messy reality. Over time, this belief becomes embedded in routine. People repeat actions that seem to align with how they think the world works. Habits form. Expectations settle. A sense of predictability grows, even if the world itself remains unpredictable. The belief in order becomes quieter, less questioned, because it no longer feels like an idea. It feels like the way things are. This is why humans rarely wake up each day doubting whether reality will behave at all. They assume continuity. They assume rules. They assume tomorrow will resemble today enough to make planning possible. This assumption shapes behavior far more than conscious reasoning. A person may say they do not believe in destiny or fate, yet still act as if effort should lead to results and choices should matter. These assumptions only make sense if some form of order is believed to exist. Humans also protect this belief socially. Shared explanations are repeated, taught, and normalized. Children learn what is supposed to make sense before they learn how to question it. Cultural stories reinforce the idea that the world rewards certain actions and punishes others. Even when reality contradicts these stories, the stories often remain intact because they provide structure. Without them, experience would feel unstable again. This is why humans resist explanations that suggest randomness or meaninglessness. Such ideas do not just challenge beliefs, they threaten psychological balance. Order allows people to tolerate uncertainty by believing it exists within limits. It creates a sense of control, even when control is partial or illusory. When belief in order is strong, people feel grounded. When it weakens, anxiety rises. This reaction reveals how deeply belief functions beneath conscious thought. It is not something humans hold lightly. It supports motivation, patience, and endurance. A person who believes the world has structure can wait, work, and suffer longer than someone who believes nothing connects action to outcome. This is why belief in order often becomes more rigid during times of crisis. When reality feels chaotic, the mind clings harder to structure. Explanations become simpler. Certainty becomes more attractive. Complexity feels threatening. This tightening of belief shows that order is not just an intellectual position. It is a stabilizing force. And because it stabilizes experience, humans begin to treat it as fundamental. They stop seeing it as a belief and start treating it as a property of reality itself. Once this happens, the idea that order might have a beginning becomes unavoidable. If order exists now and feels essential, then understanding where it came from feels like the key to understanding everything else. The mind begins to sense that beneath habits, meanings, and explanations, there must be a deeper structure that started it all. And this intuition quietly prepares the ground for the final shift of this truk, where belief in order turns into a search for its origin as the ultimate source of stability. When belief in order becomes deeply rooted, the human mind begins to move one step further, because maintaining order in the present is not enough. If the world feels structured now, then that structure must have a source. Order suggests arrangement, and arrangement suggests a beginning. Humans start to feel that things could not have always been this way. There must have been a moment, or a state, where order emerged from something else. This intuition does not come from evidence alone. It comes from the need for stability to feel complete. A structure without an origin feels fragile, as if it could collapse at any time. By imagining a beginning of order, humans give structure a foundation. They tell themselves that the world is not only organized, but organized for a reason. This is where belief turns into origin thinking. Humans stop asking only how the world works and begin asking why it works at all. They look backward, searching for the first cause, the first rule, the first pattern that set everything in motion. This search appears in many forms. Some imagine a natural order that unfolded step by step. Others imagine a deliberate design. Others imagine an initial balance, or a starting chaos that resolved into structure. The explanations differ, but they all serve the same function. They locate a point where order began, so that everything after it feels grounded. Once this idea takes hold, the question of where humans begin becomes inseparable from the question of where order begins. Humans see themselves as part of this structure. If the structure has a starting point, then humans, as elements within it, must also have one. The search for human origins becomes a smaller version of the search for cosmic order. It promises to explain not only where humans came from, but why the world feels predictable enough to live in. This does not mean humans ever fully agree on what the beginning was. What matters is that they agree one exists. The belief that order has an origin allows humans to trust the present and imagine the future without constant fear of collapse. It stabilizes meaning, supports explanation, and reinforces identity. From this angle, the answer of this truk becomes clear. Humans begin to think in terms of origins when belief in order becomes essential to their psychological survival. The idea of a beginning is not just about the past. It is about protecting the present from uncertainty. By believing that order started somewhere, humans give themselves permission to believe that order will continue, and that belief quietly holds their entire experience together. Over time, something quieter than belief begins to shape human life. Not a single idea or realization, but repetition. Days begin to resemble one another. Morning follows night. Actions repeat in the same order. The body wakes, moves, eats, works, rests, and sleeps again. At first, each moment feels distinct. But as repetition continues, differences soften. What once required attention becomes automatic. Humans stop noticing the details of what they do every day. This is not a failure of awareness. It is a natural response to repetition. When something happens often enough, The mind learns that it does not need full attention anymore. It can move on autopilot. This is where habit quietly takes control. Habits reduce effort. They save energy. They allow life to continue without constant decision-making, and as habits accumulate, large parts of human existence become predictable. The same roads are taken, the same gestures are repeated, the same thoughts appear at the same times. This repetition stretches time in a strange way. Individual moments lose sharp edges, and hours pass without being clearly remembered. A day can end with the feeling that nothing specific happened, even though many actions were performed. This is because memory does not store repetition well. It stores change. When life becomes repetitive, fewer moments stand out. Time feels faster in retrospect, even though it is experienced slowly while it happens. This creates a paradox. The more routine life becomes, the less it feels like it has clear beginnings or endings. Days blur together, weeks blend, years feel compressed when looked back on. Humans begin to experience life as a continuous flow rather than a series of distinct events. In this state, the question of beginnings changes again. Instead of asking when something started, humans begin to feel as if they have always been inside the same pattern. Habit creates the illusion of permanence. It makes the present feel endless, even though it is built from repetition rather than stability. This is why routines can feel comforting. They create a sense of order without requiring belief or explanation. Life simply continues in the same shape. But this comfort comes with a cost. When awareness fades, existence becomes quieter, but also less vivid. Humans can live long stretches of life without feeling strongly present in any particular moment. They function, but they do not always notice themselves functioning. This does not feel like a loss while it is happening. It feels normal. Only later, when looking back, does the absence become visible. People realize that years have passed without clear memories to mark them. Habit has carried them forward without asking for attention. And in this state, the idea of a beginning becomes even more distant. When life is repetitive, it does not feel like it is moving toward or away from anything. It feels like it is simply ongoing. This is why humans often say that time seems to disappear inside routine. It is not that time stops. It is that awareness thins out. In this frame, something important begins to appear. Humans do not always experience themselves as starting, choosing, or becoming. Much of life is lived inside repetition, where identity feels stable because nothing is questioned. This stability can last a long time. It can carry people through decades, and while it does, the question of where humans begin remains quiet, almost irrelevant. Because beginnings matter less when nothing feels like it is changing. Only when repetition breaks does the question return. But before that break happens, habit creates a different kind of origin. Not a moment in the past, but a pattern that feels like it has always been there, silently shaping existence without ever announcing when it started. Something subtle happens to awareness itself. The mind begins to step back. It no longer needs to watch every action closely because the outcome is already known. Hands move without instruction. The body follows familiar sequences. Thoughts drift while tasks complete themselves. This withdrawal of attention is not laziness. It is efficiency. Conscious focus is expensive, and habit allows humans to conserve it. Over time, more and more of life is handed over to this automatic layer. Entire days can pass with minimal conscious engagement, not because nothing happened, but because nothing required deliberate choice. This creates a strange split in experience. Life continues, but the sense of actively living weakens. A person may function well, meet responsibilities, and maintain routines, yet feel oddly distant from their own days. This distance is not immediately uncomfortable. In fact, it can feel soothing. When awareness pulls back, effort decreases, worry quiets, decisions shrink. The present becomes easier to inhabit precisely because it is not being examined. Habit acts like a soft current carrying the body forward while the mind rests. But this rest comes with a trade-off. When awareness is reduced, memory thins. Experiences that are not fully noticed are not fully stored. Later, when looking back, large stretches of life appear empty. Not because nothing happened, but because little was consciously registered. This is why people often feel surprised by how much time has passed. Years feel short in retrospect, even if they felt long while being lived. Habit stretches the present but compresses the past. And within this compression, identity quietly stabilizes. When nothing challenges routine, the self feels consistent. There is no need to redefine who one is, because the same actions keep repeating. This stability can last for a long time. It can create the sense that life has a steady center, even when that center is built on automatic behavior rather than reflection. In this state, beginnings lose importance. If today feels like yesterday and tomorrow will feel the same, then asking where things started seems unnecessary. Life feels ongoing rather than directional. Humans begin to experience themselves less as agents who initiate change and more as participants inside a pattern that carries them along. This is why routine can dull existential questions. The mind does not ask where it came from when it feels securely embedded in repetition. It simply continues. But this continuation is fragile. It depends on repetition remaining intact. As long as the pattern holds, awareness stays quiet. As long as awareness stays quiet, time feels smooth. And as long as time feels smooth, the question of beginnings remains distant, waiting for a disruption that will force consciousness to return and notice where it is and how it got there. Eventually, repetition breaks, because no pattern lasts forever. A routine is interrupted, a loss occurs, a change appears without warning. When this happens, awareness rushes back in. Actions that once happened automatically now demand attention. The mind looks around and suddenly notices itself again. This return of consciousness can feel unsettling because it exposes how much of life has been carried forward without being noticed. People often describe this moment as waking up, as if they had been moving through time asleep. With awareness restored, questions resurface. Where am I? How did I get here? When did this begin? These questions do not arise during repetition. They arise when repetition fails. This shows something important about human experience. Beginnings are not always felt at the start of life or at clear milestones. They are often felt retroactively, when the flow of habit is disrupted and the mind tries to reconstruct the path it has been carried along. In this sense, habit creates a false sense of continuity. It makes life feel as though it has no clear edges. But once the pattern breaks, those edges reappear, and the mind searches for a point of origin to reorient itself. This is why moments of change feel so significant. They force consciousness to return and demand a narrative. The mind wants to know what came before in order to understand what comes next. Within this frame, the idea of a beginning is revealed as something flexible rather than fixed. Humans do not always begin at birth, or at a single event. They begin again whenever awareness re-enters life after a long stretch of repetition. Each break in habit creates a new starting point, a moment where existence is felt sharply and questions regain urgency. From this angle, humans begin not at a single origin in the distant past, but repeatedly, at the moments when routine can no longer carry them forward unnoticed. Habit hides beginnings by smoothing time into continuity. Disruption reveals beginnings by breaking that continuity apart. And this explains why people often associate turning points, losses, or changes with feeling truly alive again. Awareness returns. Time regains texture. The present feels distinct. And with that distinction comes the renewed question of where one stands in the larger story. Within this frame, the answer of this truth becomes clear. Humans begin when repetition stops being enough to carry existence forward, and consciousness is forced to re-engage. Beginnings are not only points of origin, they are moments of reawakening. When life can no longer run on autopilot, and the mind must once again notice itself moving through time. At some point, awareness returns strongly enough for humans to notice something uncomfortable. That despite effort, planning, and repetition, much of life remains outside their control. Things happen without permission. Bodies fail. Accidents occur. Other people act unpredictably. This realization does not arrive all at once. It appears gradually, through small frustrations, unmet expectations, and moments where intention does not lead to outcome. Humans begin to sense that wanting something and getting something are not the same. This gap creates tension. The mind does not respond by accepting it calmly. It responds by trying to close the gap. Control becomes the solution it reaches for. If outcomes are uncertain, then managing conditions feels safer. Humans start organizing their environment, their schedules, their relationships, and even their thoughts in ways meant to reduce unpredictability. Control does not begin as dominance. It begins as protection. It is an attempt to make the future feel less threatening by shaping the present. This desire shows up in simple forms: planning the day, preparing for possible problems, creating rules, following routines. All of these behaviors aim to limit surprise. When control works, even temporarily, anxiety decreases. The world feels smaller, more manageable. A sense of agency returns. This reinforces the behavior. Humans learn that exerting control brings relief, so they seek more of it. Over time, this effort expands beyond immediate needs. People try to control not just what happens, but how it happens, when it happens, and why it happens. They want guarantees, not just possibilities. This shift changes how life is experienced. Instead of responding to events as they come, humans begin anticipating them. The future becomes something to be managed rather than awaited. This anticipation feels responsible, but it also creates pressure. The mind stays alert, scanning for risks, rehearsing outcomes, adjusting plans. Even rest becomes structured. Relaxation is scheduled, freedom is controlled, and yet, beneath all this effort, uncertainty remains. No amount of planning can remove chance entirely. No system can prevent loss forever. Humans sense this, and it fuels the desire for even more control. The attempt becomes self-reinforcing. The more uncertainty is noticed, the more control is sought. This cycle reveals something essential. Control is not about power, it is about comfort. Humans do not try to control the world because they can, but because they feel exposed when they cannot. Within this frame, another answer begins to form. From this angle, humans begin to change when they stop accepting unpredictability as part of existence and start actively trying to manage it. The need for control marks a shift from living inside the world to attempting to shape it, because shaping feels safer than surrender, even when the shaping can never be complete. The effort to control begins to meet resistance because reality does not cooperate indefinitely. Plans fail despite preparation. Systems break despite maintenance. People do not respond as expected. The body ages, no matter how carefully it is managed. These moments are small at first, easy to explain away as exceptions, but as they accumulate, a pattern becomes harder to ignore. Humans begin to sense that control has limits. No matter how much effort is applied, some outcomes remain unreachable. This realization produces a specific kind of discomfort, different from fear or anxiety. It is the feeling of helplessness, the awareness that intention alone is not enough. This feeling threatens the sense of agency that control was meant to protect. When control weakens, identity shakes, because humans often define themselves by what they can manage. A person who believes they are capable feels stable. When that belief is challenged, uncertainty returns. The mind responds in predictable ways. Some people tighten control even further, adding rules, restrictions, and monitoring in an attempt to seal every gap. Others withdraw, lowering expectations to avoid disappointment. Both responses come from the same source: the refusal to fully accept unpredictability. But neither resolves the tension. Excessive control increases exhaustion. Withdrawal increases emptiness. In both cases, the world continues to behave on its own terms. This exposes a hard truth. Control can influence outcomes, but it cannot command them. Humans can shape conditions, but they cannot guarantee results. This gap between influence and certainty becomes more visible with age and experience. Children often believe effort always leads to reward. Adults learn that this is not reliably true. Loss can occur without mistake. Failure can arrive without negligence. This knowledge does not sit comfortably in the mind. It creates a lingering sense of vulnerability. When this awareness settles in, humans begin to feel smaller in relation to the world. Not insignificant, but limited. This limitation is not physical alone. It is existential. It reveals that no amount of intelligence, planning, or discipline can fully protect against chance, decay, or the actions of others. In response, the mind searches for new ways to cope. If control cannot be total, perhaps it can be redirected. Humans begin to distinguish between what they can influence and what they cannot. This distinction brings some relief, but it also confirms helplessness in certain areas. Accepting limits reduces exhaustion, but it does not remove discomfort. There remains a quiet frustration, the sense that something essential is missing. This is because control was never just about managing events. It was about securing meaning. When outcomes feel unpredictable, actions feel less justified. Effort feels risky. Commitment feels dangerous. Humans want their actions to matter, not just occasionally, but reliably. The mind begins to suspect that there must be forces larger than individual control shaping events. This suspicion does not yet resolve the tension, but it shifts the focus. Attention moves away from personal ability and toward underlying causes. Within this frame, another answer begins to surface. From this angle, humans begin to confront a new version of themselves when they realize that control has boundaries they cannot cross. This confrontation does not end the desire for control. It transforms it. The question shifts from, how can I control what happens, to what controls what happens? And that shift prepares the ground for the final movement of this truk, where helplessness pushes the mind toward deeper origins in search of something stable enough to explain why control always falls short. The human mind looks for stability in a different direction. If control cannot be total at the level of action, then perhaps it can exist at the level of understanding. Humans begin to accept that they cannot manage every outcome, but they resist the idea that outcomes are meaningless. This resistance redirects the need for control into a need for cause. Instead of asking how to prevent every loss, the mind begins to ask why loss exists at all. Instead of trying to command events, it tries to explain them. This shift feels subtle, but it is profound. Control over reality gives way to control over interpretation. If events cannot be changed, they can at least be placed inside a framework that makes them feel necessary rather than random. This is where helplessness quietly fuels the search for deeper origins. Humans begin to suspect that if individual control always fails at the same boundaries, then those boundaries must be shaped by forces larger than personal effort. These forces may be called nature, structure, law, or design. But the impulse behind the naming is the same. The mind wants to locate something stable beneath uncertainty, something that explains why control works sometimes and fails other times. By tracing events back to an origin, humans regain a sense of orientation. They may not be able to change what happens, but they can understand how it fits into a larger order. This understanding restores a form of agency, not the power to act freely, but the power to situate oneself within a system. From this angle, the question of where humans begin becomes tightly connected to the experience of helplessness. If life contains forces that cannot be controlled, then knowing where those forces come from feels essential. Origins promise explanation. They suggest that unpredictability is not chaos, but part of a structure that started somewhere and follows its own logic. This belief does not remove suffering or limitation, but it makes them feel less personal. Failure becomes part of a process rather than a reflection of inadequacy. Loss becomes something that belongs to existence itself, not just to individual mistakes. Within this frame, the answer of this truth becomes clear. Humans begin to search for beginnings when control reaches its limits, and helplessness forces a change in strategy. When action can no longer secure safety or meaning, understanding takes its place. The search for origin becomes a way to live with limits by believing that what cannot be controlled can at least be explained. And that explanation offers a different kind of stability, one that allows humans to endure a world they cannot fully command. At some point, controlling outcomes and understanding causes are still not enough for humans, because life is not experienced only as something that happens, but as something that should or should not happen. Humans begin to judge actions, not only by what they produce, but by whether they feel acceptable. This shift is subtle, but powerful. Two actions can lead to the same result, yet feel completely different depending on intention, context, or perceived fairness. This is where morality quietly enters experience. It does not begin as a system of rules. It begins as a feeling that something is right or wrong, even when no direct consequence follows. Humans feel guilt without punishment. They feel pride without reward. These reactions cannot be explained by survival alone. They suggest that humans are not only navigating the world, but evaluating it. This evaluation changes behavior deeply. A person may avoid an action that benefits them because it feels wrong. Another may endure harm because it feels justified. These choices do not always maximize survival or comfort, but they preserve something else, a sense of internal coherence. Humans want their actions to align with values, even when that alignment costs them. This desire creates a new layer of experience. Life is no longer just about what happens, but about what should happen. Once this layer appears, the world becomes morally charged. Events are no longer neutral. They are interpreted through standards. Fairness matters. Responsibility matters. Intention matters. This is why humans react strongly to perceived injustice, even when they are not directly affected. A violation of moral expectation feels like a violation of order. The mind resists it. This resistance reveals how deeply morality is tied to stability. Right and wrong provide orientation in a complex social world. They help humans predict behavior, assign trust, and maintain cooperation. Without some shared sense of moral boundaries, social life becomes chaotic. But morality does more than regulate society. It also stabilizes the self. When humans act according to values, they feel consistent. When they violate them, they feel fractured. This inner response reinforces moral judgment long before formal rules or laws exist. Over time, these judgments become internalized. People begin to carry a sense of right and wrong inside themselves, applying it even when no one is watching. This internal presence marks a major shift. Control was about managing outcomes. Explanation was about understanding causes. Morality is about evaluation. It asks not what happened or why, but whether it was acceptable. And once this question becomes central, human experience changes again. Actions are no longer just movements through the world. They become statements about who someone is. Identity becomes linked to values. A person begins to see themselves as good or bad, justified or unjustified, based on alignment with internal standards. This alignment matters even in isolation. This suggests that morality is not only social pressure, it is a way humans relate to themselves. From this angle, humans begin to differ from other life when they stop acting only in response to outcomes and start judging actions through values that exist beyond immediate benefit. The appearance of right and wrong marks the point where existence becomes not just lived, but assessed, and that assessment quietly reshapes how humans understand themselves and their place in the world. As moral judgment settles into experience, it begins to serve a practical function beyond personal feeling. Humans quickly learn that shared standards make life with others possible. When people agree on what is acceptable, cooperation becomes easier, trust can form, expectations become clearer. A promise means something because breaking it is judged. Harm matters because causing it carries moral weight. These shared judgments reduce uncertainty in social life. Without them, every interaction would require constant negotiation. Morality simplifies complexity by setting boundaries in advance. It tells people what behavior will be tolerated and what will not. This allows societies to function without continuous conflict. Over time, these boundaries become reinforced through repetition, approval, and disapproval. Children learn what is right not through abstract reasoning, but through response. Praise, correction, and example shape their sense of value. Eventually, external judgment becomes internal. A person no longer needs to be watched to follow moral rules. They carry them inside. This internalization is powerful. It allows social order to persist even in private. People restrain themselves not only out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire to remain consistent with who they believe they are. Morality thus stabilizes identity as much as it stabilizes society. It provides a framework that answers the question of how to act when outcomes are uncertain. Even when consequences are unclear, values offer guidance. This reduces decision fatigue. Instead of calculating every possible result, a person can act according to principle. This feels grounding. It gives behavior a sense of direction that does not depend on immediate success. But this stability comes with tension. Moral systems can conflict. Different groups hold different standards. What is right in one context may be wrong in another. This creates friction, both between societies and within individuals who navigate multiple moral worlds. Still, humans tend to cling to moral structure even when it creates discomfort. The alternative, moral emptiness, feels worse. A world without shared values feels unpredictable and unsafe. People would not know what to expect from one another. Meaningful cooperation would collapse. This fear explains why moral systems are defended so strongly. They are not just opinions, they are supports holding social life together. When moral order is threatened, people react emotionally, sometimes violently, because the threat feels existential. It suggests that the rules keeping chaos at bay may be failing. This reaction shows that morality is not simply about kindness or fairness. It is about stability. It allows humans to live together without constant fear. It also allows individuals to feel coherent over time. Acting according to values creates a narrative of self. A person can say, "This is who I am because this is how I act." Without this narrative, identity would feel fragmented, driven only by circumstance. Within this frame, morality becomes a bridge between the individual and the group. It aligns personal behavior with shared expectations. It creates a sense of belonging while also setting limits. And as these systems deepen, humans begin to treat moral values as more than agreements. They start to see them as grounded in something real, something that exists beyond preference. This belief prepares the way for the final movement of this truk, where humans begin to ask not only what is right, but where the idea of right itself comes from and why it should matter at all. When moral rules feel essential rather than optional, the human mind begins to push beyond agreement and habit, because something that carries such weight cannot feel arbitrary. If right and wrong truly matter, then they must come from somewhere deeper than convenience or preference. Humans begin to sense that values need grounding. A rule followed only because others expect it feels fragile. A value that disappears when no one is watching feels incomplete. This discomfort drives a new kind of questioning. Instead of asking what is right, humans begin to ask why right should exist at all. They search for a source that can justify moral force even in isolation. This search appears whenever people appeal to ideas like justice, dignity, or worth that seem to stand above individual desire or social agreement. These ideas feel larger than any one person or group. They suggest that some actions are wrong even if everyone approves of them, and some actions are right even if they bring no reward. Once this belief takes hold, morality stops feeling like a tool and starts feeling like a truth. Humans begin to treat values as discoveries rather than inventions. They speak of moral order as something to be found, preserved, or violated, not merely chosen. This shift has powerful effects. It allows people to judge not only behavior, but systems, traditions, and histories. Entire ways of life can be labeled unjust. This judgment only makes sense if values are believed to exist independently of current practice. And once values are seen this way, the question of origin becomes unavoidable. If right and wrong are real in some deep sense, then where did they come from? Are they built into reality? Did they emerge from human nature? Did they begin at a particular moment? Humans return to these questions again and again because moral experience demands an answer. Living with values feels different from living with preferences. Values claim authority. They ask to be obeyed even when costly. To live under such authority without understanding its source creates tension. So the mind looks backward, searching for a beginning that can support the weight of moral judgment. This search does not always produce agreement, but it produces commitment. People are willing to argue, defend, and even sacrifice for their moral origins, because those origins anchor meaning. Within this frame, the answer of this truth becomes clear. Humans begin to seek origins when moral judgment becomes central to identity and action. The question of where humans begin merges with the question of where values begin. Because understanding the source of right and wrong feels necessary to justify why actions matter at all, morality turns existence into something accountable, and accountability demands a foundation. The search for that foundation pulls the human mind back toward beginnings, not as a historical curiosity, but as a requirement for living with conviction in a world where choices carry moral weight. At a certain stage, humans stop experiencing the world only as a collection of physical things and begin to experience it as a field of signs. Objects no longer stand alone. They point beyond themselves. A sound can mean danger. A mark can mean ownership. A gesture can mean trust or threat. This shift does not require complex thought. It begins with association. When the same object appears alongside the same outcome often enough, the mind links them. Over time, the object no longer needs the outcome to be present. Its presence alone is enough to trigger meaning. It becomes what it represents. Humans begin to live inside this layer of representation without noticing it. A flag is no longer fabric. It is belonging. A word is no longer sound. It is an idea. A face is no longer a face. It is intention, memory, relationship. Once this layer forms, perception changes. Humans no longer react only to what is physically happening. They react to what things stand for. A quiet room can feel tense. A simple object can carry emotional weight. The world becomes dense with invisible meaning. This density allows humans to coordinate, remember, and plan in ways that direct experience alone cannot support. Symbols compress complexity. They allow large ideas to be carried in small forms. A story can be held in a name. A rule can be held in a symbol. A shared past can be held in an image. This compression changes how time is experienced. Meaning can be carried forward without reliving the original event. A symbol preserves experience. It allows memory to survive without constant recall. But this power comes with a consequence. Once symbols exist, humans begin to live more in representation than in direct contact. They respond to signs of danger rather than danger itself. They pursue symbols of success rather than the experience of fulfillment. They defend symbols of identity even when the physical stakes are small. This does not mean humans are confused. It means their reality has expanded. Life now happens on two levels at once, the physical and the symbolic. And the symbolic often feels more important. This is why conflicts can erupt over words, images, or gestures that cause no physical harm. The harm is symbolic. It threatens meaning. When symbols are violated, people feel personally attacked, even if nothing tangible has changed. This reaction shows how deeply symbolic thinking is embedded in human experience. Humans do not merely use symbols, they live inside them. And once this is the case, the question of beginnings changes again. If meaning is carried by symbols, then understanding where meaning begins requires looking beyond bodies, brains, or even events. It requires asking when the world first became something that could stand for something else. In this frame, another answer begins to appear. Humans begin to differ from other life, when reality stops being only what is seen and becomes something interpreted. The moment a thing can mean more than itself, human experience crosses a threshold. Existence is no longer just lived, it is read. And once the world is read like a text, the need to know where the text began becomes inevitable. Once symbols take root, they begin to reorganize memory itself. Humans no longer rely only on lived experience to remember who they are or what has happened. Memory becomes structured around signs. A photograph replaces a moment. A date replaces a lived period. A name replaces a complex relationship. These symbols do not store experience exactly as it occurred. They simplify it, compress it, and make it portable. This allows humans to carry large portions of their past without reliving them. But it also reshapes what is remembered. What fits into symbols survives. What does not slowly fades. Over time, people begin to remember their lives not as a flow of sensations, but as a sequence of symbolic markers. Graduation, marriage, loss, success. Each word stands in for years of experience. This symbolic structure makes identity manageable. A person can say who they are using a small set of labels, roles, and stories. Without symbols, the self would feel overwhelming, too large to grasp at once. Symbols provide handles. They allow humans to refer to themselves and others without reopening every memory. As identity becomes more symbolic, it becomes less immediate. People begin to relate to who they think they are, rather than who they are feeling in the moment. A role can override sensation. A label can override experience. Someone may continue to act confident because that is their identity, even when they feel uncertain. Another may feel trapped because a symbol attached to them no longer fits. This tension reveals how powerful symbols are. They do not just describe identity, they guide it. Humans align their behavior with the symbols they carry. A parent behaves as a parent. A leader behaves as a leader. These behaviors persist even when circumstances change, because symbols create expectations that feel real. Memory, identity, and meaning begin to orbit around these symbolic anchors. This orbit stabilizes life. It makes social interaction predictable. It allows long-term planning, but it also hardens experience. When symbols become too rigid, they resist change. A person may grow internally while their symbolic identity remains fixed. This creates inner conflict. Still, humans rarely abandon symbols altogether. The alternative would be to face raw experience directly, without compression or structure. That would be exhausting. Symbols protect the mind by filtering reality. They reduce complexity to something livable. This is why humans become attached to them, even when they cause tension. And as symbols accumulate across generations, they form shared frameworks. Cultures are built from symbols layered on symbols. Flags, myths, laws, names, rituals, each one carries meaning that far exceeds its physical form. These shared symbols allow individuals to step into identities that existed before they were born. A person can inherit a story, a role, a meaning. This inheritance feels grounding. It connects the present self to a larger timeline. And with this connection, the question of beginnings deepens again. If identity and meaning are carried through symbols, then understanding where those symbols originated feels crucial. Humans begin to sense that to understand who they are now, they must understand how these symbols came into being. Meaning feels less arbitrary when it has a history. A symbol with an origin feels more legitimate than one that appears without explanation. Within this frame, the pull toward beginnings grows stronger. It is no longer just about events or biology. It is about the first moments when meaning itself took form and began shaping memory and identity in ways that continue long after the original experience has disappeared. When symbols become the main way humans organize meaning, the question of origin can no longer be avoided, because symbols do not feel neutral. They carry authority. They tell people how to see, how to feel, and how to act. A symbol that has no origin feels weak, temporary, easy to replace. A symbol that is believed to come from a beginning feels grounded. It feels legitimate. This is why humans instinctively ask where symbols came from. Who first used this word? Who created this sign? Why this gesture means respect and not something else? These questions are not about curiosity alone. They are about trust. Humans want to know whether the meanings guiding their lives rest on something solid. Once symbols shape memory, identity, and society, their origins begin to matter as much as their function. A symbol tied to a beginning feels anchored in time. It connects the present to a moment when meaning first appeared. This connection stabilizes experience. It tells people that what they live by now is not arbitrary, but part of a longer continuity. This is why myths, traditions, and foundational stories appear wherever symbolic systems exist. They do not merely explain the past, they justify the present. They say this is why this symbol matters, and why it should continue to matter. Without such justification, symbols feel fragile. They can be questioned, replaced, or ignored. Humans resist this fragility because living inside symbols requires commitment. A life guided by meaning demands belief in that meaning's legitimacy. And legitimacy comes from origin. The deeper and more distant the origin feels, the stronger the symbol becomes. This does not mean the origin must be historically accurate. It must feel foundational. It must feel like the moment when meaning entered the world. Once this belief takes hold, humans begin to experience their own beginnings symbolically as well. Birth becomes more than a biological event. It becomes a marker, a starting point in a story. Identity becomes something that begins not only when a body appears, but when meaning attaches to it. Names, roles, expectations arrive. The self becomes readable. This is why humans rarely experience themselves as raw existence. They experience themselves as characters inside symbolic narratives that began before they were aware of them. Within this frame, the answer of this truck becomes clear. Humans begin to search for beginnings when they live inside symbols, because symbols demand origins to sustain their authority. The question of where humans begin merges with the question of where meaning begins. Because once life is interpreted rather than merely lived, existence feels incomplete without a point where interpretation itself started. Beginnings become the place where meaning is believed to have entered the world, and believing in that place allows humans to continue reading their lives as stories rather than facing experience without structure or sense. At a certain point, humans stop experiencing life as a series of disconnected moments and begin to experience it as a story. Events are no longer just things that happen and then disappear. They are linked together, ordered, and given roles. Something else becomes a turning point. Another becomes a mistake, a lesson, or a success. This linking does not happen automatically. It is created by the mind. Humans look back at what they have lived and arrange it into a narrative that explains who they are now. This narrative does not need to be perfectly accurate. It only needs to feel coherent. A person can forget many details and still feel certain about their story. I am someone who struggled. I am someone who overcame. I am someone who failed and learned. These statements do not describe every moment of life, but they give shape to it. Without this shape, experience would feel scattered and hard to hold. The story acts as a container. It gathers memory, meaning, and value into something the mind can carry. This is how the sense of self begins to stabilize. A human does not only exist, a human exists as a character inside a story they tell themselves. This character has traits, motives, and a past that explains present behavior. Even decisions made in the moment are influenced by this story. A person may act bravely because that fits who they believe they are. Another may hesitate because their story says they are cautious or unlucky. In this way, the narrative does not follow life. Life follows the narrative. The story becomes a guide. It tells the person what actions make sense and which ones feel out of place. This guidance reduces uncertainty. Instead of facing each moment as entirely new, humans interpret it through what it means for their story. This interpretation brings comfort. It allows people to endure hardship by placing it inside a larger arc. Suffering feels different when it is seen as part of a journey rather than a random blow. Even pain can feel meaningful if it fits the story of becoming someone better or stronger. This does not mean the story is always healthy. Some narratives trap people. A story of failure can limit possibility. A story of superiority can distort empathy. Still, humans rarely abandon narrative altogether. The alternative would be to face life without continuity, without explanation of how yesterday connects to today. That would feel disorienting. Stories create identity by connecting time. They allow a person to say, "This is who I have been, this is who I am, and this is who I might become." Without this connection, the self would feel fragmented, reset at every moment. Within this frame, another answer begins to form. From this angle, humans begin to experience themselves not when they first act or think, but when they first tell a story that links their actions and thoughts together. It is narrated into existence, and once life is lived as a story, the question of beginnings takes on new importance, because every story needs a starting point to make sense of everything that follows. Once a story about the self takes shape, it does not remain static. Humans repeat it, reinforce it, and protect it over time. The story is told internally through memory and expectation, and externally through conversation, explanation, and justification. Each time it is told, it becomes a little more solid. Details that fit the narrative are remembered more easily. Details that contradict it are softened, reinterpreted, or forgotten. This is not dishonesty. It is coherence at work. The mind prefers a stable story to a perfectly accurate one, because stability allows identity to persist. When humans talk about their past, they rarely list events in neutral order. They select, they emphasize, they frame. A difficult childhood becomes the reason for strength. A single success becomes proof of talent. A failure becomes a defining flaw. These interpretations are repeated until they feel like facts. Over time, the story becomes a filter. New experiences are evaluated based on whether they confirm or threaten the existing narrative. If something fits, it is welcomed. If it does not, it feels uncomfortable or confusing. This is why change can be so difficult. Changing behavior is often easier than changing the story that explains the behavior. A person may act differently for a while, but if the narrative remains the same, the old identity pulls them back. The story demands consistency. Humans feel pressure to behave in ways that match who they believe they are. Acting outside the story can feel inauthentic, even if it leads to better outcomes. This pressure explains why people sometimes sabotage opportunities that contradict their self-narrative. A person who sees themselves as unlucky may distrust success. A person who sees themselves as strong may avoid asking for help. These choices do not come from logic alone. They come from loyalty to the story. The narrative offers certainty. It answers the question of, who am I, without requiring constant re-evaluation. That certainty feels safe. It reduces anxiety. It allows the mind to predict itself. But this safety has limits. When life changes faster than the story can adapt, tension appears. A role ends. A relationship breaks. In these moments, people often feel lost, not because they lack ability, but because the story that guided them no longer works. This loss of narrative feels like a loss of self. Humans describe it as not knowing who they are anymore. This reaction shows how deeply identity depends on story. The self is not just awareness or memory, it is continuity created by repeated narration. Without that narration, experience feels fragmented. Even positive change can be destabilizing if it cannot be integrated into the existing story. This is why humans instinctively try to rewrite rather than abandon their narratives. They look for ways to explain change as part of the same story rather than the end of it. Growth becomes evolution. Loss becomes transformation. These reinterpretations allow identity to survive disruption. Within this frame, another answer begins to surface. From this angle, humans begin to exist as stable selves, not when they first have experiences, but when they learn to keep telling the same story about those experiences over time. The repetition of narrative is what gives the self endurance. And as long as the story holds, identity feels continuous, even as life itself keeps changing underneath it. When a self is held together by story, that story begins to feel incomplete without a clear starting point. Humans are uncomfortable with narratives that simply appear in the middle. A story that has no beginning feels unstable, as if it could dissolve at any moment. This discomfort drives the mind backward. People begin to search for the moment when their story truly began, not just biologically, but narratively. Childhood memories are reinterpreted. Early experiences are highlighted or reshaped to serve as origins. A single event becomes the reason everything else followed. This process does not happen because the beginning was objectively decisive. It happens because the present self needs a foundation. A story with a beginning feels justified. It explains why the character is the way they are now. Without that explanation, identity feels arbitrary. Humans want to believe that who they are makes sense, that it follows from something earlier rather than emerging randomly. This is why people often say things like, "This is where it all started." The phrase is rarely literal. It is symbolic. It marks the point where meaning is projected backward to support the present narrative. Once this happens, the beginning gains power. It becomes a reference point. Choices are evaluated in relation to it. Changes are measured against it. Even attempts to reinvent the self often rely on redefining the beginning rather than abandoning it. A person may say they are starting over, but even that implies a new narrative origin. The need for a beginning reveals something essential about the human mind. Identity is not only about continuity, it is about justification. Humans do not just want to exist. They want their existence to feel coherent. A beginning provides that coherence by turning life into a story that unfolds logically rather than a sequence of unrelated events. This logic does not need to be true in a factual sense. It needs to be livable. The story must hold. When it holds, the self feels real. When it breaks, the self feels lost. This is why disruptions that threaten the narrative are so painful. They do not just change circumstances, they threaten the story's foundation. Within this frame, the answer of this truth becomes clear. Humans begin to ask where they started when the self becomes a story that needs grounding. The search for origins is not about the past for its own sake. It is about stabilizing identity in the present. A beginning anchors the narrative. It allows the self to feel continuous, justified, and meaningful. And as long as humans live through stories about who they are, they will continue to look backward, searching for a starting point that can hold the weight of everything they believe themselves to be now. As the search for beginnings reaches its furthest point, something unexpected starts to appear. The realization that every beginning humans point to is chosen rather than discovered. A moment is selected and called the start. A story is framed and treated as the origin. A cause is isolated and given priority over all others. But none of these points announce themselves as beginnings on their own. They become beginnings only when the human mind decides to stop tracing backward and say this is enough. This decision is rarely conscious. It happens quietly, through comfort. The mind settles on a starting point that feels stable enough to hold everything that follows. This is why different people and cultures point to different beginnings without feeling confused. One may begin with birth, another with ancestry, another with creation, another with chance. Each of these works not because it is final, but because it allows the story to move forward. This reveals something important. Beginnings are not fixed locations in the past. They are positions chosen by the present. Humans do not find where they began. They decide where to stop looking. This decision brings relief. Endless searching is exhausting. At some point, the mind needs rest. A chosen beginning provides that rest by closing the question temporarily. It gives experience a frame. Inside that frame, life can be lived, explained, judged, and remembered. Without such a frame, everything would feel open, unresolved, and heavy. This is why the idea of a single, true beginning is so compelling. It promises an end to uncertainty. It suggests that once the correct starting point is found, everything else will make sense. But this promise never fully delivers. Each beginning explains some things and leaves others untouched. The mind senses this, even as it clings to the beginning it has chosen. Humans move between beginnings, adopting new ones when old ones no longer support the weight of experience. A beginning that once felt solid may later feel thin. The human mind adapts its origins to survive changing conditions. From this angle, the question of where humans actually begin starts to dissolve. Not because it has been answered, but because it has been reframed. Humans do not begin at a single point in time. They begin wherever meaning is anchored strongly enough to allow life to continue. The beginning is not behind us. It is under us. It is the foundation we stand on at any given moment, and because that foundation can shift, the beginning can move as well. This does not make human existence unstable. It makes it dynamic. Life continues not because the beginning is fixed, but because it can be re-chosen. Within this frame, another understanding quietly forms. Humans begin not when something first happened, but when the mind decides that what happened is enough to support a story. And that decision is repeated again and again, each time life demands a new place to stand. Once the idea of a fixed beginning loosens, another realization follows that humans do not actually live inside answers. Answers feel solid, but they are short-lived. They close something, and once closed, they stop working. Life keeps moving, experience keeps changing, and the answer that once felt sufficient slowly becomes outdated. What remains constant is not the answer, but the question. Humans carry questions with them for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. These questions change shape, soften, or sharpen, but they rarely disappear. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What does this mean? These questions do not demand immediate resolution. They create a space in which life can unfold. When a person lives inside a question, they remain attentive. They observe. They reflect. They adjust. A question keeps the mind open in a way an answer never can. This openness is not always comfortable, but it is alive. It allows new meaning to enter. This is why moments when all questions seem answered often feel strangely empty. Certainty removes tension, but it also removes movement. Humans need a certain level of uncertainty to keep existing forward. Too much closure creates stagnation. Too much openness creates anxiety. Life happens in the balance between these two. A question that has no final answer becomes a quiet companion. It does not need to be solved. It only needs to be carried. In this sense, the search for beginnings is not a hunt for a fact. It is a way of staying oriented while moving through uncertainty. The question, where do humans actually begin, keeps attention anchored without demanding resolution. It allows the mind to circle experience without fixing it in place. This is why humans return to the same questions across centuries, cultures, and lives. Not because they fail to answer them, but because the questions themselves serve a function. They keep meaning flexible. They prevent experience from hardening into dogma. When a question remains open, it can absorb new understanding without breaking. This flexibility is essential for survival in a changing world. Humans who live entirely inside rigid answers struggle when reality shifts. Humans who live inside questions can adapt. They may feel uncertain, but they remain responsive. From this angle, The absence of a final beginning is not a flaw. It is a feature. It allows human existence to remain unfinished, and unfinished things can continue. A life that does not claim to know exactly where it started remains capable of becoming something else. This does not mean humans reject answers altogether. They use them when needed, but they do not stay in them forever. They move back into questioning when answers begin to restrict growth. And so the beginning remains out of reach, not because it is hidden, but because reaching it would end the movement that keeps life alive. Within this frame, another understanding settles in. Humans do not persist because they have solved the question of origin. They persist because they can live inside it. The question itself becomes a place to stand, a space wide enough to hold uncertainty without collapsing. And as long as the question remains open, life can continue to unfold without needing to arrive anywhere final. As the question returns one last time, it no longer asks to be solved, it only asks to be held. Where do humans actually begin? Not as a puzzle to finish, but as a quiet space to rest inside. After all the searching, the tracing back through body and mind, memory and time, fear and meaning, control and story, humans keep beginning because they never fully arrive. Every explanation offered along the way was enough for a moment, and then life moved again. Each origin gave stability until it could no longer carry the weight of what followed, and so another beginning was chosen, not to replace the old one, but to allow movement to continue. This is not failure. It is how human existence stays alive. A fixed beginning would close the story. An open question keeps it breathing. When the mind no longer strains to locate the first moment, attention softens. The need to define fades. What remains is the awareness of being here now, carried by countless beginnings that do not need to be named. Birth was one, memory was another. Meaning entered, belief settled, habit carried time forward. Loss woke awareness, story shaped identity. Each of these felt like a beginning because each allowed life to continue in a new way. None of them needed to be the first. They only needed to be enough. And perhaps this is the quiet truth humans circle without ever stating directly. The beginning is not behind us waiting to be found. It is under us. Wherever we are able to stand without falling. It shifts as we shift. It holds as long as we need it to, and then it lets go. The question remains because it does not demand closure. It allows rest. It allows uncertainty without fear. It allows existence without explanation. And as the mind releases its grip on finding the start, the body settles back into rhythm. Breathing continues. Time passes without being measured. Thought slows. The question does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter. Where do humans actually begin? Perhaps not at a point in the past, but in the moment the search itself becomes gentle enough to stop asking for an answer. And in that pause, where nothing needs to be defined, life continues, unbothered by origins, moving softly forward into sleep.